You're standing on the dock at sunset. Right there, tied to the cleat, floats a small sailboat, 28 feet, maybe less. And you think no way a person could actually live on that. That's exactly what I thought. I was wrong. Here's the truth I resisted for years. A sailboat smaller than most bedrooms can become a warm, dry, full-time home for under $1,000 a month, docked or anchored, without you giving up a single comfort that matters. I didn't believe it. I laughed at the guy who told me. Then I tried it, and it broke everything I assumed about what a home has to be. I still remember the first night I slept aboard, in a marina in Rock Hall, Maryland, listening to the water tap the hull, absolutely certain I'd made a terrible mistake. Stay with me, because there's a 125-year-old book, published in 1900, that quietly laid out the whole blueprint long before anyone was selling it back to us. And everything I'm about to show you works whether you're near the ocean, a lake, or a river, on a fixed income, starting this year. Let me tell you how a lifelong skeptic ended up living on the water and paying less to live better than he ever had on land. When I first started looking into this, I assumed the boat was the expensive part. That's the belief almost everyone has. You picture a boat and you picture a rich man's toy, teak decks, a price tag with too many zeros. So I want to challenge that right away, because it's the single lie that keeps most people from ever looking. The boat is the cheapest part of the whole thing. Let me give you real numbers, the kind I wish someone had handed me before I wasted 2 years being scared of the idea. In 1969, a couple named Lynn and Larry Pardee set sail on a boat they'd built for a fraction of what a house cost, and they spent the next several decades living aboard and crossing oceans. Their entire philosophy fit into 6 words that I now have written on a piece of tape above my little galley stove. Go small, go simple, go now. They weren't selling a fantasy. They were reporting what they'd actually done. Here's what the boat market looks like when you stop believing the myth. A solid, seaworthy sailboat from the 1970s or 1980s, 27 to 30 feet, built when fiberglass hulls were laid up thick and heavy because nobody trusted the new material yet, regularly sells today for between $5,000 and $15,000. I bought mine, a 1978 Cruiser, for $7,200. A used car in the driveway costs more than my home. And those old hulls are the secret nobody advertises. Builders in that era over-engineered everything because they were afraid the fiberglass would fail. It didn't. Those boats are now 50 years old and structurally sound, while the thin, cost-cut hulls built last year will not last half as long. Older was built stronger. That's the pattern I kept running into with everything I tested, on the boat and off it. So the entry cost stopped scaring me. But the moment I got past that, a bigger fear moved right in behind it, and it's the one that nearly made me quit before I started. Money to buy it was one thing. Money to keep it floating was another. Everybody warned me the real cost of a boat is the slip fee, the maintenance, the endless bleeding of your wallet. I heard the old joke a dozen times that a boat is a hole in the water you throw money into. And I believed it, right up until I sat down and did the arithmetic against what I was already paying to live in a normal apartment. Here's what I was spending on land. Rent, a little over $1,400. Electric and gas, another $200. Water and trash, $60. Renter's insurance, and all the small invisible costs of a big space you have to heat, cool, fill with furniture, and light every single night. Now here's my life on the water, and I tracked every dollar for a full year before I trusted it. My marina slip, in a modest working harbor, not a fancy one, runs about $350 a month, and that includes my dock electric and my water. If I choose to anchor out instead, which I do for months at a time in good weather, that number drops to nearly nothing. My boat insurance is around $40 a month. My cooking gas, a single propane tank, lasts me about 6 weeks and costs under $20 to refill. When I added it all up, I was living for roughly 1/3 of what land had cost me. And I want you to hear the part that shocked me most, because it wasn't the savings. It was that I felt richer inside a space the size of a garden shed than I ever had in a place with rooms I never used. But money saved is only worth something if you're actually comfortable, and that's the objection I could hear in my own head. So let me get to the thing everybody quietly worries about and nobody says out loud. Where does everything go? This was my deepest doubt. I am not a minimalist by nature. I like my things. I assumed living small meant living crammed, tripping over boxes, miserable within a week. What I found instead was a body of design knowledge, worked out over 2 centuries by people who had no choice but to solve it, and it changed how I see every home I walk into now. Boat builders figured out something land architects forgot. Every surface can do 2 jobs. On my boat, the bench I sit on to eat lifts up, and inside it is where I keep my winter clothes. The steps I climb to go on deck pull away, and behind them sits my engine and a storage bin. My bed has 3 deep drawers under it. The table folds flat against the wall when I don't need it. Nothing is wasted. Nothing sits idle. The old sailors had a phrase for this, a rule of the sea that goes back to the age of wooden ships. A place for everything and everything in its place. It wasn't a tidiness slogan. It was survival. On a boat that's pitching in a storm, a loose object is a weapon, and a thing you can't find is a thing that might cost you. So they built a world where every single item had one home and you always knew where it was. Living inside that logic did something to my mind I didn't expect. The clutter I'd carried for 40 years turned out to be almost entirely things I never touched. When you can only keep what earns its place, you discover how little you actually need to be content. I got rid of 9/10 of what I owned, and I have never once missed a single thing I let go. That was the moment my skepticism cracked for good, because I realized this wasn't really about boats. It was about a way of living that we've been slowly talked out of. Somebody, somewhere, benefits from you believing you need 3,000 square feet and a storage unit besides. And once I saw that, I started asking a harder question. Who taught us that bigger was better, and when did we start believing them? Here's where it turns, because the forgetting wasn't an accident. For most of human history, small and self-reliant was simply normal. People lived on canal boats in England, on houseboats in the harbors of every port city, on modest craft that were both transport and home. In the 1930s, during the hardest years this country ever saw, thousands of families lived aboard boats, not as a lifestyle choice, but because it was affordable and it worked. The knowledge was ordinary. Your grandfather might have known someone who did it. Then something shifted after the Second World War. The whole machine of modern life was rebuilt around one idea, that you should buy a large house, fill it with financed furniture, heat and cool and insure and maintain it, and spend the best decades of your life paying for the space itself. The bigger the house, the bigger everything attached to it. And the profit in that arrangement flows in one direction, away from you, every month, for 30 years. Living small didn't disappear because it stopped working. It disappeared because there was almost no money in it for anyone but the person doing it. Nobody runs advertisements telling you that you could be happy and free on a $15,000 boat because there's no industry standing behind that message. No monthly payment, no loan officer, no 30-year hook. The silence around it isn't proof that it's a bad idea. The silence is the whole point. That realization made me a little angry, honestly. I'd spent decades assuming the expensive way was the only way, because the cheap way had simply been erased from the conversation. And the more I dug, the more I found people who'd quietly kept the knowledge alive, passing it hand to hand, out of sight of the mainstream. But knowing all this raised the fear that had been sitting under everything, the one I hadn't wanted to face. Comfort in fair weather is easy. What about when it's cold, when it's dark, when the wind comes up? Could I actually stay warm and safe in a small boat in winter? That question kept me up at night, so I went looking for the answer the hard way. I spent my first full winter aboard in a northern harbor, and I braced for misery. What I learned is that a small space is the easiest thing in the world to keep warm, and it's the big houses that are the hard part. Picture yourself standing at that same cleat, coin in hand, tapping along a hull you're thinking of buying. Not sure if that dull thud means solid fiberglass or a rotten problem waiting to drain your savings. That's exactly the moment First Principles was built for. It walks you through the coin tap survey trick that reveals a rotten, water-soaked hull in under 2 minutes, the warning signs that turn a cheap deal into a nightmare repair bill, and the plain questions that stop you from overpaying for somebody else's problem. Pair it with deep leverage and you get the small, cheap fixes for things like trailer hubs and leaks that most owners assume need a mechanic, and the full system ties it all into one calm, buy it right, run it cheap routine. Here's your free test tonight, no boat required. Go find any coin in your pocket right now, tap it against a wooden tabletop or a hollow door, and just listen to how a solid, dense spot sounds different from a soft, dull one. That's the same ear you'll be using on a real hull. The fastest way to get the books is to scan the QR code right there on your screen, or go to the link in the description or the pinned comment. Boats get bought and sold in every season, so this kind of buyer knowledge never really goes out of date. Now, let's get back to why that old, heavy hull turned out to be worth more than the shiny new ones. Think about it plainly. Heating a large home means heating enormous volumes of air in rooms nobody's standing in. My entire living space is smaller than a single bedroom, and it's wrapped in water that never drops below freezing, which acts like a mild, steady blanket around the hull. A small heater that costs pennies a day kept my cabin so warm I slept under a single blanket while the deck outside wore a coat of frost. The old-timers solved the moisture problem, which is the real enemy on a boat in winter, not the cold. When warm breath and cooking steam hit a cold hull, you get condensation, and damp is what makes a boat miserable. The traditional fix, used on working boats for generations, is simple air movement and a little gentle dry heat, plus something I would have laughed at a year earlier. You crack a hatch, even in winter. A tiny constant exchange of air keeps the inside dry, and dry air at 55 degrees feels warmer and healthier than damp air at 70. I also learned to insulate the way the old boats did, not with expensive modern kits, but with what was already aboard. Cushions against the hull sides, a wool blanket hung over the companionway at night, exactly the way sailors hung canvas dodgers a century ago to break the wind. Small, cheap, reversible, and it worked better than I had any right to expect. By spring, I'd stopped being a skeptic entirely. I was warm, I was dry, I was spending almost nothing, and I was sleeping better than I had in years, rocked gently every night by the water. But I know exactly what some of you are thinking right now, because I thought it too. You're thinking, this is fine for him, but I don't live near the coast. I'm not buying a boat this year. This doesn't apply to me. I made this next part especially for you, because the truth is you don't need a boat at all to use the most valuable things I learned out here. Everything I discovered on the water is really a set of principles about living well in a small space with little money, and every one of them works in an apartment, a spare room, a cabin, or the house you already own. Let me hand them to you plainly, so you can start this week with what you have on hand. Start with the one home rule I learned from the sea. Pick one drawer, one shelf, one corner, and give every object in it a single fixed place, not a vague zone. An exact spot. On the boat, this is survival, but in a kitchen, it's the difference between calm and chaos. When everything has one home, you stop losing things. You stop buying duplicates of things you already own, and you discover how much you were storing that you never use. Do one drawer today. You'll feel it immediately. Next, the double duty principle. Look at every large piece of furniture in your home and ask what second job it could do. A storage bench instead of a chair. A bed you can put bins under. A folding table that clears the wall when you're done. You don't need to buy new things. You need to demand more from the things you already have, exactly the way a boat demands it, because there's no room to waste. Then the heating trick. And this one saves real money on land right now. Stop heating rooms nobody's in. Close the doors, shut the vents, and heat only the space where your body actually is. On the boat, I heat one small volume of air and I'm perfectly comfortable. In a house, you can do the same thing with a single warm room, a closed door, and a blanket over a cold window at night. the way the old sailors hung canvas against the wind. Your furnace is heating square footage you're not using, and that's money floating straight out the roof. And the moisture lesson matters in any home, especially the tight, sealed modern ones. A little air movement and a crack of ventilation prevents the damp, the mold, and the stale heaviness that makes a closed-up house feel sick. Dry air at a lower temperature is more comfortable and cheaper than damp air cranked up high. None of that requires a dock, a boat, or a single dollar spent. It requires seeing your space the way a sailor is forced to see his, as something that should serve you, not something you serve. That shift alone is worth more than most of the advice I ever paid for. But I promised you something at the very start, and I've saved it for last on purpose, because it's the piece that pulled the whole thing together for me, and it comes from a source almost nobody reads anymore. Let me tell you about the book that started all of this, and the single overlooked idea buried inside it. In 1900, a sailor named Joshua Slocum published a book called Sailing Alone Around the World. He was the first man to sail alone all the way around the globe, and he did it on a small wooden boat he rebuilt himself, the Spray, 36 feet, on almost no money. The book became famous for the voyage. But what almost everyone misses, and what I only found by reading the thing cover to cover on a rainy night aboard, is that it's secretly the most practical guide to self-reliant small living ever written. Slocum's genius wasn't courage. It was a habit of mind. He wrote about how he provisioned, how he preserved food without refrigeration, how he fixed everything himself with what he had, how he made a tiny space serve every human need. And there's one specific method in there that stopped me cold, because it's so simple and so forgotten that I had to try it that same week. Slocum kept his stores from spoiling using nothing but the way he stored them: dry, dark, sealed, and off the hull where the temperature stayed even. He carried sacks of flour, and rather than let them go buggy or damp the way everyone expected on a long voyage, he coated and packed them so carefully that he was still baking good bread months into the ocean, thousands of miles from any store. The principle underneath it is one the old households all knew and we threw away when the refrigerator arrived. Most food doesn't spoil from time. It spoils from air, light, moisture, and swinging temperature. Control those four things and ordinary food keeps far longer than anyone today believes. So I tested it, land style, with nothing fancy. I took my flour, my rice, my beans, my sugar, and instead of leaving them in their paper bags in a cabinet by the warm stove, I did what Slocum did. Sealed them airtight, kept them dark, kept them somewhere cool and steady, off the outer wall where the temperature swings. Months later, everything was as fresh as the day I packed it. No bugs, no stale smell, no waste. Here's why that matters more than it sounds. The average household throws away a staggering amount of food and money every year. Not because the food went bad on its own, but because it was stored the way marketing taught us. In the open, in the warm, in the light, in packaging designed to be seen and sold, not to last. A sailor in 1900, with no electricity and no store for 1,000 miles, ate better and wasted less than most modern kitchens do today. The knowledge was never lost. It was just left out of the story, because there's no profit in teaching you to keep what you already have. That was the moment my whole journey clicked into place. The boat was never really the point. The point was a way of living that people knew for centuries, and we were slowly, quietly talked out of, one convenience at a time. Slocum wrote it down 125 years ago. The parties lived it in our own time. And it was all sitting there, waiting for anyone willing to stop believing that the expensive way was the only way. I started out certain that living on a small sailboat was a fantasy for other people, and I ended up with a warmer, cheaper, freer life than I ever had on land, and a handful of old truths I can use anywhere, forever. If you're the kind of person who trusts what actually works over what you're constantly being sold, who'd rather test a thing with your own hands than take the salesman's word for it, then this way of thinking already belongs to you. You just had to be reminded it existed. Now, I want to hear from you and be specific, because I read these. Which one hit you hardest? The $7,000 boat that costs less than a used car, the one home rule from the age of wooden ships, or Slocum's way of keeping flour fresh for months at sea. Tell me in the comments, and tell me where you're watching from, a coast, a lake, a landlocked town in the middle of the country. I genuinely want to know how far this reached. And if you believe, like I now do, that the old, tested, self-reliant ways deserve to be dug back up and handed around before they're forgotten for good, then come along with the rest of us who are doing exactly that. There's a whole quiet movement of people recovering what convenience made us forget, and you belong with them. Next time, I'm going to show you the forgotten way people kept an entire home cool through brutal summers with no electricity at all, using a trick from the desert that's older than the country itself, and it costs almost nothing to build. I tested it in the worst heat of the year, and I still can't believe how well it worked. I was the biggest skeptic there ever was. Now I sleep on the water, spend a third of what I used to, and wonder how I ever believed the expensive way was the only way. Come find out what else they quietly stopped telling us. This video gave you the overview, but if you want to go further, come inside the Old Ways Almanac, where I pick up right where I stopped. In there, you can ask me your own question, and a real person, me or my team, answers you. And you won't be alone. Thousands of Old Ways folks like you are already inside. Just point your phone's camera at the code on the screen. Cancel anytime. One click.